In September of 1973, 120 people gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, for a family reunion. They came from across the country. Some came from Europe. They were the descendants of the man who had been, at the moment of his death in 1877, the wealthiest person in the history of the United States. A man whose fortune, adjusted for the size of the American economy at the time, exceeded that of any individual who has lived in this country, before or since. They were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had begun his life with nothing and had built, through 60 years of systematic ruthlessness, the most significant private fortune the country had ever produced. Not one of them was a millionaire. The university itself was there. The Commodore had donated the money to found it in 1873, 4 years before his death, the single largest philanthropic gift he ever made, and the one piece of the fortune that proved impossible to spend. The building that carried his name still stood on the campus where his descendants gathered, but the money that had built the building, the money that had built the railroads and the shipping lines and the mansions on Fifth Avenue and the castles at Newport and the largest private house in the United States, still standing in the mountains of North Carolina, that money was gone. Every dollar of it, in 96 years. Now here is the question this video is going to answer. Cornelius left behind the equivalent of $235 billion in today's terms. He left it to his son William, who doubled it in 8 years. William then divided it among his 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters, giving the 2 eldest between $60 and $70 million each, and $10 million to each of the remaining 6. These were the 9 heirs. These were the people who received what 2 generations of the most focused financial intelligence the country had ever produced had built. What happened next is not simply the story of extravagant spending. The Vanderbilt children built 48 mansions in a single generation. They built Newport cottages that cost more than the largest palaces of European royalty. They commissioned 140-foot steam yachts and private railroad cars upholstered in silk, and gave parties that cost $250,000 for a single evening. But that is not what this story is really about. This story is about what happens when the person who builds a fortune is so focused on building it that he forgets to transmit the understanding that made it possible. When the skills and the instincts and the specific relationship with money that produced the fortune die with the man who had them, and what remains is only the money itself, floating free of the knowledge that created it. Drop your city in the comments. And if these stories matter to you, the ones about what dynasties actually cost the people inside them, subscribe. Now let us go back to Staten Island in 1810 to a 16-year-old boy who borrowed $100 from his mother and bought a boat. And let us find out what he built and what he failed to pass on. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on May 27, 1794, in Port Richmond on Staten Island, the 4th child of Phoebe Hand and Cornelius Vanderbilt, a farmer and ferryman whose family had been in New York since the 17th century without accumulating anything that could be called wealth. He was not educated. He attended school sporadically in his early years and had no patience for it. The classroom was the wrong shape for the mind he had, which was a mind organized entirely around the immediate and the practical, around the specific problems of getting from one place to another and the money that changed hands in the process of doing it. He understood boats before he understood books. He understood trade before he understood arithmetic. He understood in the specific way that certain people understand certain things before they can explain them, that moving people and goods between points was a business that would grow as long as the country grew, and that the country was going to grow without stopping. He borrowed $100 from his mother at 16 and bought a periauger, a flat-bottomed sailing vessel, and began ferrying passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan, charging 18 cents per person. He was good at it in the specific way that distinguishes a person who has found their native element from a person who is practicing a skill they have been taught. Effortlessly, instinctively, with the particular confidence of someone for whom the work is not work, but simply the expression of what they are. He dropped the Van from the family name and became Vanderbilt, Simpler, more American, less Dutch. By the time he was 40, he owned most of the steamboat traffic on the Hudson River. He had gotten there by undercutting established competitors, offering free passage and making his money on the concessions, then gradually raising prices once the competition was gone, and by working with a physical intensity that the people who worked for him found both inspiring and frightening. He arrived before his employees and left after them. He knew every inch of every boat he owned and every route he operated, and every competitor's schedule and the prices of fuel and labor and insurance and repair to a precision that no operator of his scale had any practical necessity of knowing. He knew them anyway. The knowing was the thing. The specific, intimate knowledge of the economics of what he was doing was the source of the advantage that no competitor could fully match, because no competitor would tolerate the discomfort of knowing everything while also being responsible for everything. He had 13 children with his first wife, Sophia, whom he married in 1813 at the age of 19. He was home rarely. He worked constantly. Sophia managed the household and the children in the specific way that the wives of men like Cornelius managed households, by doing everything that needed to be done and expecting nothing that the man in question was not constitutionally capable of providing. He treated his children with the same impatience he brought to everything that was not the immediate business of making money. He did not explain himself to them. He did not sit them down and teach them what he knew about boats and rates and the psychology of competitors and the management of risk. He expected them to watch and to absorb and to demonstrate through their own performance that they were worth his attention. Most of them were not, in his assessment. The assessment was harsh and frequently wrong and occasionally right, and the consequences of it lasted for 3 generations. William Henry Vanderbilt was the oldest son. His father called him a blockhead and a blatherskite. He called him this in the presence of other people, which is the specific kind of cruelty that leaves marks of the most durable kind. He considered William unfit for business and sent him to a farm on Staten Island when William was 19, effectively exiling him from the commercial world that was the only world the Commodore considered worth inhabiting. William went to the farm. He managed it. He turned a failing agricultural operation into a profitable one through the same systematic attention to detail and cost and yield that his father had applied to steamboats, and which he had apparently absorbed from watching his father despite never having been taught it directly. He ran the farm for 12 years. His father eventually noticed. Cornelius brought William back into the business in the 1860s when the railroads were beginning to supersede the steamboats as the dominant transportation technology, and when his aggressive acquisition of railroad companies required someone he could trust to run them. William ran them. He ran them with the competence that the farm had demonstrated he possessed, and he ran them with the additional competence of a man who had something to prove to the person whose judgment of him had defined the first 40 years of his life. He proved it. When the Commodore died in January of 1877, William inherited $94 million. The bulk of an estate that left his other surviving children comparatively small amounts, and that provoked the legal challenges from those siblings that William eventually settled at considerable personal cost. He took the railroads that his father had assembled and ran them with the same systematic intelligence his father had applied, and he doubled the fortune in 8 years. $200 million. At the moment of William Henry Vanderbilt's death in December of 1885, the Vanderbilt family was the wealthiest family in the world, and then he divided it. This was the decision that made everything that followed inevitable. Not the dividing itself, and the original practice of concentrating everything in a single heir had produced its own damage, the lawsuits from the excluded children, and the resentment that ran through the family for decades. William's decision to distribute the estate more broadly, to give each of his 8 children a meaningful inheritance, rather than one child everything and the others almost nothing, was in many respects a more humane arrangement. But it was an arrangement that had no mechanism for preserving what the distribution destroyed. The Commodore's fortune had been built by one mind with one strategy applied over 60 years. His son had doubled it by applying a similar mind to a similar strategy for 8 more years. The 2 men had collectively accumulated and managed the fortune for 68 years. They understood it in the bones. They understood what it was made of and what it required to maintain it, and what happened when the specific daily disciplines that had created it were relaxed. When William divided the $200 million among 8 children, he was dividing not just the money, but the obligation to maintain it. Spreading that obligation across 8 people who had not been formed by the experience of creating the money and who had been given, each of them, a sum large enough to live on indefinitely without the discipline of maintaining the enterprise that had produced it. He gave each of his 4 younger children $10 million. $10 million in 1885 was sufficient to sustain a family at the highest level of American social comfort, essentially forever, if managed with any competence at all. It was not managed with any particular competence. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was the oldest of William Henry's children, and the one who inherited the largest share, approximately $70 million, along with the primary responsibility for managing the New York Central Railroad system that was the family's commercial engine. He was a serious man. By the accounts of the people who knew him, he was the most serious of the 8 children, the one who understood, at some level, that the fortune he had inherited was not simply a resource for personal enjoyment, but a responsibility that connected him to what his father and grandfather had built. He went to work. He managed the railroad with a conscientiousness that the Commodore would have recognized, if not quite matched. He served on numerous philanthropic boards. He gave substantial sums to institutions of genuine public benefit. He also built the Breakers. The Breakers stands on Ochre Point in Newport, Rhode Island, 4 acres of Gilded Age access that architect Richard Morris Hunt designed after the palaces of Genoa and Turin. It has 70 rooms. The Great Hall rises to a height of 45 feet. The dining room seats fully 200 guests. The grounds slope to the Atlantic Ocean, which the Vanderbilt family used as a backdrop for their social performance, with the specific satisfaction of people who have discovered that the Atlantic Ocean is, in fact, available for use as a backdrop. It cost $3 million to build in 1895 dollars, which is to say it cost, in the currency of a railroad company's working capital, something in the range of $100 million in contemporary terms. Cornelius II began having strokes in 1896. He was 52 years old. He died in 1899 at 55, having suffered a series of increasingly debilitating attacks that the stress of managing both the fortune and the railroad, while simultaneously maintaining the social obligations of the position he had inherited, had not helped him survive. He died without having appointed an adequate successor to the management of the railroads, without having adequately prepared his own children for the inheritance they would receive, and without having reconciled the fundamental tension between the seriousness with which he approached his responsibilities and the scale of personal expenditure that the Vanderbilt social position required him to maintain. The Breakers still stands. The Preservation Society of Newport County manages it and opens it to the public. 1 million visitors a year walk through the 70 rooms and look at the 45-foot ceiling of the Great Hall and understand, in the way that museum visitors understand, what it meant to be rich in America in 1895. What they do not always understand, because the museum does not emphasize it, is that the man who built this monument to Vanderbilt wealth was dead at 55, worn out by the effort of maintaining what his grandfather had built and his father had doubled, and which was, by the time of his own death, already beginning the process of dispersal that would end in 1973 with 120 descendants who could not collectively produce a millionaire. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was Cornelius II's youngest surviving son, born in 1880, and his story is the specific story of the 4th generation's relationship with the fortune, which is to say it is the story of a man who received substantial wealth as the inheritance of an inheritance, and who spent it with the focused determination of someone who had no particular plan beyond enjoying it. He had no plan because no plan had been given to him. His father, Cornelius II, had worked himself to death managing the railroad and maintaining the social position that the Vanderbilt name required, and had died at 55, having modeled for his children a life organized around obligation rather than either pleasure or genuine creation. His mother, Alice, had managed the household and the charitable commitments and the social calendar that the position demanded, and had done so with competence and without particular warmth. Reginald had grown up in the Breakers, which is to say he had grown up in a building designed to express the social ambitions of people who were already dead, by the time he was old enough to understand what it expressed. He drank. He gambled. He spent money on horses, which was the Vanderbilt family's recurring method of converting capital into entertainment. The Commodore had kept horses. His son had kept horses. Cornelius II had kept horses, and Reginald kept horses with the particular thoroughness of a man who had nothing more pressing to do. He married first when he was 23, briefly and disastrously. He married again in 1920 at the age of 39 when he married Gloria Morgan, who was 18 years old. He was 44 years old when their daughter Gloria was born in 1924. He died the following year in 1925 at the age of 45 of cirrhosis. He had spent, in the 24 years between his inheritance at 21 and his death at 45, essentially all of what Cornelius II had left him. Little Gloria, as she was known to distinguish her from her mother, was 18 months old when her father died. She would be the subject of one of the most notorious custody battles in American history, fought between her mother Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt and her aunt Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the sculptor and arts patron, another of Cornelius II's children, over the question of which branch of the depleted Vanderbilt fortune could provide better care for the child. The battle was covered by the press with the specific intensity that stories about famous families and contested children produce, and the term poor little rich girl, which had been applied before to other wealthy children in difficult circumstances, attached itself to Gloria Vanderbilt and followed her for the rest of her life. The irony of the term in the Vanderbilt context was that by 1924 the rich part was already substantially qualified. Reginald had left essentially nothing. The trust fund that the law required to be maintained for Gloria until she came of age was modest by Vanderbilt standards, enough to sustain her care, but not the kind of sum that the family's name implied. The Vanderbilt fortune that had organized the social world of New York in the 1880s and 1890s had already, by the 1920s, so substantially dissipated that one of Cornelius's great-granddaughters could be described, with some accuracy, as poor. Gloria Vanderbilt built her own fortune. She became a painter, a designer, a writer, an actress, a businesswoman whose name and image and aesthetic sensibility were the things she monetized rather than any inherited wealth, because the inherited wealth was not there to monetize. The Jean Vanderbilt genes of the 1970s and 1980s bore the Vanderbilt name, but the Vanderbilt effort, her own effort not inherited, was what made them valuable. She died in 2019 at 95. Her son Anderson Cooper inherited her estate, which was the product of her own work rather than any remnant of the original accumulation. The Vanderbilt name had value. The fortune had not been there for 3 generations. William Kissam Vanderbilt was the second son of William Henry, and his story is the story of what happens to a fortune when its management is delegated to the person it was supposed to impress. He married Alva Erskine Smith in 1875. This was the defining transaction of his life, though not in the sense he intended when he made it. Alva was from a Mobile, Alabama family, whose genteel poverty had given her a ferocious social ambition and a specific intelligence for the management of status that William Kissam, who was wealthy and somewhat passive and primarily interested in horses and automobiles and yachting, was entirely unprepared to match. She was, in the vocabulary of the Gilded Age, a climber. She intended to climb to the top. The Vanderbilt money was the instrument of the climb. She built 665th Avenue. The William Kissam Vanderbilt Mansion, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the French chateau style, completed in 1882, using the $3 million legacy that William had received from his grandfather and which was technically William's money, but which was practically Alva's project. The house was one of the most talked about buildings in New York. It was the stage on which Alva intended to perform the social conquest that would establish the Vanderbilts definitively and irrevocably at the apex of New York society. The conquest took the form of a ball. On March 26, 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball at 665th Avenue that cost $250,000 and invited 1,200 guests. Every person, that is, who Alva had determined was worth knowing in New York, with the single and deliberate exception of Mrs. Caroline Astor, the woman who had been, until that moment, the undisputed authority on who was and was not worth knowing in New York. Mrs. Astor had not called on Alva. The social code of the era required that an established family call on a new one before the new family could properly invite the established one to anything. Mrs. Astor had not called. Alva sent cards to everyone at Astor's World except Mrs. Astor herself, and then waited for Mrs. Astor's daughter, who desperately wanted to attend the ball, to arrange her mother's capitulation. Mrs. Astor called. She received her invitation. She attended the ball. The 400, the social elite whose definition and membership she had controlled for decades, acknowledged, in the act of attending, that the Vanderbilts had arrived at the altitude that Alva had been purchasing for them with William's money. Alva divorced William Kissam in 1895, citing adultery. She received $2 million in the settlement, the Newport mansion called Marble House, that she had also built with Vanderbilt money, and full custody of their 3 children. She then married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont and eventually became one of the most significant American suffragettes of the early 20th century, converting Marble House into a headquarters for the women's suffrage movement. She had used the Vanderbilt fortune to buy her way into society, and then used the social position she had purchased to build a second career as a reformer. The money had served her purposes. What it had done to William Kissam Vanderbilt and to the fortune is a more complicated assessment. He had inherited $55 million. He spent a portion of it on horses and racing and a magnificent steam yacht called the Alva, which he renamed the Valiant after the divorce. He built a racing road on Long Island, the Vanderbilt Cup, that was among the earliest and most significant automobile racing circuits in the United States. He was, by the accounts that survive, a man of genuine personal charm and genuine private unhappiness, a man whose life had been organized around a social project that was his wife's rather than his own, and who had spent the years after the divorce trying to find what his own project was. He died in France in 1920. He was 70 years old. The fortune was substantially diminished. Consuelo Vanderbilt was William Kissam and Alva's daughter, born in 1877, and her story is the story of what the Vanderbilt fortune purchased when it was used as a social instrument rather than as a financial one. She was beautiful. She was also, by 1895, when she was 18 years old, the target of her mother Alva's most ambitious social scheme, the purchase, with Vanderbilt money, of an English duke. The Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th holder of the title, was in financial difficulty. The great English dukedoms of the late Victorian era were not, as a class, financially stable. The agricultural rents that had sustained the aristocracy for centuries had collapsed in the Depression of the 1870s and 1880s, and the houses and estates that the dukes were obligated to maintain required income that the estates were no longer generating. The Duke of Marlborough needed money. Alva Vanderbilt had money. Consuelo did not want to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She was in love with a young American named Winthrop Rutherford. She told her mother this. Her mother locked her in her room and told her she would marry the Duke or be responsible for whatever happened to Alva's health, which Alva described as fragile in terms that Consuelo found impossible to dismiss as theatrical. The wedding took place in November of 1895. The settlement was significant. Alva provided the Duke with a dowry of $2.5 million in Vanderbilt Railroad stock and a guaranteed annual income of $100,000. The Duke got the money. The Duke's palace, Blenheim, got the renovations its roof required. Consuelo got the title of Duchess of Marlborough and a marriage she had not chosen with a man she did not love in a country where she did not feel at home. The marriage lasted 11 years. They were separated in 1906 and divorced in 1921. Consuelo eventually had the marriage annulled by the Catholic Church on the grounds of coercion, the coercion being her mother's emotional pressure. She later married Jacques Balsan, a French aviator who was by her account the man she had actually wanted to spend her life with. She was 50 years old when she married him. Her mother Alva, who had forced the first marriage, became the president of the National Woman's Party and one of the most significant American suffragettes of the early 20th century. She converted Marble House, the Newport mansion she had built with Vanderbilt money and received in the divorce from William Kissam, into a headquarters for the suffrage movement. She had used the Vanderbilt fortune to purchase social position, then used the social position to advocate for the liberation of women from the kind of forced social arrangements that had organized her own daughter's marriage. The specific irony of this did not appear to escape Consuelo. The other 6 children of William Henry Vanderbilt received $10 million each. What they did with it, and what their fates reveal about the specific character of inherited wealth when it is distributed to people who did not earn it, is the part of the Vanderbilt story that the Newport mansions and the Fifth Avenue ballrooms tend to obscure. Florence Adele Vanderbilt married Hamilton McCown Twombly, a man who understood finance and who managed the Twombly fortune with the same diligence applied to the railroad fortune. Florence and Hamilton were the exception in the 3rd generation, the branch of the Vanderbilt family that did not spend everything, that maintained what they had received, that built and preserved rather than simply consumed. Florence outlived almost everyone. She died in 1952 at the age of 98, having outlasted her brothers and sisters by decades, and her estate was still substantial at her death. She was not interesting in the way that the others were interesting. No divorces, no scandals, no castle at Newport that required $3 million to build, and a staff of 40 to maintain. She managed the money and lived comfortably, and gave to charitable causes, and was remembered fondly by the people who knew her, and forgotten almost entirely by everyone else. Frederick William Vanderbilt received his $10 million and built Hyde Park. Not the Hyde Park of the Roosevelt family, which is what most people think of when they hear the name, but a different Hyde Park, the Vanderbilt Hyde Park Mansion along the Hudson River in Dutchess County, New York. Frederick and his wife Louise had no children. He devoted himself to the property and to his roses, and to the methodical, quiet life of a wealthy man with no particular ambitions beyond the management of his estate. He died in 1938. His will left the estate and its contents to the National Park Service, since he had no heirs. The National Park Service maintains it today as a National Historic Site. George Washington Vanderbilt II was the youngest of the sons, born in 1862, and he received the smallest of the major bequests. $10 million plus the Staten Island property that was eventually converted to other uses. What George did with his $10 million was build the Biltmore. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, is 178,926 square feet. It is the largest privately owned house in the United States, a record it has held since it was completed in 1895. George commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt, who also designed the breakers, and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park Terminal, to create an estate in the mountains of western North Carolina that would serve as a private retreat from the social warfare of New York and Newport. The house has 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a banquet hall, and a library that contains 23,000 volumes. George spent approximately $6 million of his $10 million inheritance building it. He then spent considerable additional sums maintaining it, which required a full-time staff, along with the surrounding estate of 125,000 acres that he was simultaneously attempting to manage as a sustainable agricultural and forestry operation. He died in 1914 at the age of 51, from complications following an appendectomy. He had been, by the accounts of the people who knew him, the most intellectually serious of all 8 children, a genuine scholar who spoke 8 languages, and had assembled his 23,000-volume library with the care of a person who actually intended to read the books. His daughter Cornelia inherited the estate and eventually opened it to the public, which is the only reason it still exists as an intact property rather than having been subdivided and sold. It receives about 1 million visitors a year. George had no particular gift for money management. He had a gift for the things that money could build, and he built one of them, and it stands. Emily Thorne Vanderbilt married William Douglas Sloan and received her $10 million and lived the life of a wealthy woman of her era, the charitable committees and the Newport summers and the Fifth Avenue winters, without particular distinction in either direction. She later married Ambassador Henry White after Sloane's death, which gave her a connection to the diplomatic world that her contemporaries found impressive. Eliza Osgood Vanderbilt married William Seward Webb and received her $10 million and built a Vermont estate called Shelburne Farms on a property of several thousand acres on Lake Champlain, which was intended as a model agricultural operation and which the Webb family eventually transferred to a nonprofit organization that operates it today as a working farm and educational institution. Margaret Louisa Vanderbilt married Elliot Fitz Shepard, a lawyer of some distinction, and received her $10 million and spent her adult life in the world of New York philanthropy and social events. She produced 5 children, none of whom became particularly prominent. These 6, Florence, Frederick, George, Emily, Eliza, and Margaret, received between them $60 million of the $200 million estate that William Henry had built. The record of what they did with those $60 million is a record of comfortable dissipation. Not dramatic, not scandalous, simply the ordinary process by which money that is not actively managed tends to drift downward through the generations until it reaches the level at which it is no longer a major force in anyone's life. The specific mechanisms by which $200 million becomes nothing are worth examining precisely because the Vanderbilt story is not simply the story of extravagant spending, though there was extravagant spending, and it is not simply the story of incompetent investing, though there was incompetent investing. It is the story of the intersection of several forces that were each individually manageable, but that together produced an outcome that was mathematically inevitable. The first mechanism was dilution. The elder Vanderbilt had concentrated the fortune in one heir. William Henry spread it across 8. Each of those 8, when they died, spread their portion across their own children. By the 3rd generation, the $200 million sum that had been a force capable of moving markets and financing railroads had been subdivided into portions small enough to sustain comfortable private lives, but not large enough to maintain the social position that the Vanderbilt name required. The social position was the second mechanism. The Vanderbilt name, right by the 1880s and 1890s, carried expectations that could only be met by continuous and spectacular expenditure. The Newport cottages were not optional in any meaningful social sense. They were the proof of membership in a specific community, and the proof required constant renewal. The balls and the yachts and the private railroad cars were not luxuries that could be declined without cost. They were the currency of the social world that the Vanderbilt fortune had purchased entry into, and that required ongoing investment to maintain. The word they used for these buildings tells the whole story. They called them cottages. The Breakers was a cottage. Marble House was a cottage. A 70-room palace modeled on the palaces of Genoa and Turin was, in the vocabulary of the Newport summer, a cottage. The word was not irony for its own sake. It was a claim. It said that what they were doing was ordinary, that people of modest inclinations naturally spent their summers this way. Cornelius had not been interested in claiming modesty. He was interested in being rich, which is a different thing entirely from demonstrating it. The railroads were the third mechanism. The fortune that had been built by one generation and maintained by the next was built on the railroads, and the railroads were an industry in transition. The regulatory environment was changing. The Interstate Commerce Commission, established in 1887, began imposing restrictions on railroad pricing that reduced the margins that had made the family's railroad investments so valuable. The competitive environment was changing. Other railroads, other operators, other financial interests were competing for the traffic that had once been more thoroughly dominated by the Vanderbilt system. And the management was changing. As the family members who ran the railroads died and were replaced, the specific knowledge of the business that had been the source of competitive advantage was replaced by professional management that was competent but not exceptional. The fourth mechanism was the failure of inheritance, not the legal mechanics of inheritance. Those functioned as designed, but the transmission of understanding. Cornelius understood money in the bones. He had earned it, which means he had learned it, which means he knew what it was in a way that cannot be taught and can only barely be transmitted even to children who watch carefully. William Henry had watched carefully enough to double it. His children had watched less carefully or been taught less specifically, and the grandchildren had watched almost not at all. By 1973, the Vanderbilt descendants gathered at the university that bore the family name, and not one of them was a millionaire. He had given $1 million to found that university in 1873, 100 years before that reunion. It was the single largest gift he ever made to any cause outside his family. It was also, in the long run, the only Vanderbilt expenditure that produced something lasting. The university that still exists, that still carries the name, that was still there when everything else was gone. The Commodore's personal habits are worth examining because they are the clearest expression of the specific understanding of money that made the fortune possible and that his grandchildren entirely lacked. He did not spend on himself. This is the fundamental fact about Cornelius Vanderbilt that his descendants could not absorb, or did not try to absorb, or could not reconcile with the world they actually lived in. He was the richest man in America, and he lived like a man who was comfortable and no more. He had a house, he had a horse, he had a carriage, he had a staff. These were the possessions of a man of substance, a wealthy merchant, a successful businessman, but they were not the possessions of the wealthiest man in the country. He did not build a Newport cottage. He did not build a Fifth Avenue mansion of 40 rooms. He did not throw balls for 1,200 guests. He wore the same suits until they wore out. He kept track of his personal expenditures with the same precision he brought to his business accounts, and he treated money spent on personal comfort that exceeded what was necessary as money wasted, which was money lost, which was the thing he had no tolerance for. This was not performance. This was not the ostentatious frugality of a man who wants to be admired for his self-denial. It was simply the practice of a man for whom money was so immediately connected to the work of accumulating it that spending it on anything other than the expansion of the enterprise felt like undoing what the work had done. He could not transmit this to his grandchildren because it was not a principle that could be transmitted. It was a feeling, a visceral, bone-deep sense of what money was and where it came from and what was owed to the process of creating it. You could not teach this feeling. You could only develop it by going through what he had gone through, by borrowing the $100 and working the route and competing with the established operators and building from the experience of having had nothing the understanding of what everything required. His grandchildren had never had nothing. They had been born into everything, and everything had always been there, and everything would always be there. And there was therefore no reason to understand what everything actually was or what it would require to remain there. By 1973, everything was not there. He had borrowed $100 and built a fortune. His descendants had inherited that fortune and divided it and subdivided it and spent it on the proof that they deserved it, and by the time they gathered at the university that bore his name, they were the proof of something else entirely. The proof of what happens when the person who understands the thing does not find a way to transmit the understanding before he dies. He was the last Vanderbilt who understood what a Vanderbilt was. Everything else is the story of what happened after he was gone. The 48 mansions that the Vanderbilt family built in a single generation are not a metaphor. The number appears in the historical record as a specific count. In the 30 years following the 1885 division of the estate, members of the Vanderbilt family constructed 48 separate large-scale residential properties. In New York, in Newport, in Asheville, in Hyde Park, in the Berkshires, in France, in England, in locations across the eastern United States and the European continent, where the social world of the Gilded Age required a Vanderbilt presence. 48 mansions in one generation, by 8 people and their children. The math of this is not difficult. If you divide the $200 million estate among 8 people, giving the 2 eldest $70 million and $55 million respectively, and $10 million to each of the remaining 6, you get a total distribution of approximately $195 million. If you then build 48 mansions with costs ranging from $3 million for the breakers to $6 million for the Biltmore to smaller sums for the other 46, you have spent, conservatively, accounting only for construction and not for furnishing, staffing, maintenance, and annual operating costs, somewhere between $50 and $100 million on buildings. Buildings that, unlike the railroads they replaced as the primary deployment of Vanderbilt capital, generated no income. The railroads moved goods and people and charged for the service. The mansions moved nothing. They housed the family and their guests and the social performances that the family's position required, and they generated no return on the capital they represented except the social currency of the membership in a specific world that they certified. The social currency depreciated. The capital that purchased it did not return. His grandchildren confused the mansions for the power they represented, the buildings as the point rather than instruments of a point, and they spent accordingly. The 48th mansion built in that generation is not known by name. The records of Vanderbilt family construction in that period are extensive but not entirely catalogued. It was probably a moderately large estate in the Berkshires or on the Hudson, built by one of the secondary branches of the family with a portion of the $10 million inheritance, and it probably no longer stands, having been demolished or converted or sold to pay debts in the decades after the building boom that produced it. The Breakers, the Biltmore, Marble House. These survive because they were large enough to attract institutional support. The smaller properties are gone, absorbed into the landscape of places that were once grand and are now subdivisions or parking lots or simply land. The money that built them is also gone, which is to say that the 48 mansions produced in the end the same result as the $100 borrowed from his mother. Nothing that was physically permanent beyond what it built. The difference is that the $100 built a railroad empire. The mansions built museums. Alva Vanderbilt's assault on New York society in the 1880s is the most famous single episode in the history of the Vanderbilt fortune's dissolution, but it is not the most consequential. The most consequential episode is one that happened quietly, in offices and courtrooms, and the private calculations of men who understood finance, and it is an episode that the Newport balls and the Breakers tours tend to obscure. The New York Central Railroad. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899, the management of the New York Central passed to William Kissam, who was the next oldest surviving son and who had the nominal authority, but not the deep operational knowledge to run a railroad at that level. William Kissam managed it in a way that maintained its value, but did not grow it. He was, by temperament and by inclination, a steward rather than a builder, and the railroads needed builders in the first decade of the 20th century if they were going to compete with the new financial interests that were consolidating American industry in every sector. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, William Kissam's son, the fourth generation, took a seat on the New York Central Board and eventually mounted a proxy battle to retake operational control of the railroad in the 1950s. He lost. The New York Central, the railroad that Cornelius had assembled and that had been the financial engine of the family's fortune for 80 years, was by then controlled by interests that had no particular connection to the Vanderbilt family. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt had invented contract bridge, had won the America's Cup 3 times, and had lost the New York Central. That is not an unfair summary of what the fourth generation of the Vanderbilt family did with what it had inherited. The New York Central itself eventually merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1968 to form Penn Central, which went bankrupt in 1970. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history at the time. The railroad that the Commodore had built, that William Henry had doubled, that Cornelius II had stewarded, that William Kissam had maintained, and that Harold Sterling had lost in a proxy fight. It ended in bankruptcy. The Commodore's fortune had gone from the world's largest to nothing in 96 years. His railroad had gone from the financial engine of the American economy to a bankruptcy filing in 93. The Newport social season that Alva Vanderbilt organized and dominated in the 1880s and 1890s was not simply entertainment. It was, in the vocabulary of the Gilded Age's social architecture, an industry whose product was the certification of social status and whose raw material was money converted through the specific mechanisms of conspicuous expenditure into the currency of belonging. The Newport cottages, the term cottage applied to structures of 30, 40, 70 rooms with the specific irony of people who found the joke amusing, were not simply houses. They were statements. They were the physical embodiment of the claim that their owners were making about their position in the social hierarchy, and the claim had to be renewed each summer with a new round of entertainments and improvements, and the visible evidence of ongoing investment in the display. The Breakers made its claim in the language of Genoese and Turinese palaces. Marble House made its claim in the language of Versailles. Its gold ballroom was modeled on the Hall of Mirrors, which was not an accident but a deliberate invocation of the most famous room in the most famous palace of European monarchy, a claim that the Vanderbilts were, in their American way, the equivalent of royalty. Rosecliff, which was not a Vanderbilt property, but was built by Teresa Fair Ulrichs with money from the Nevada silver mines, and which Richard Morris Hunt also designed, made its claim in the language of the Grand Trianon at Versailles. The Newport cottage industry required new statements each season, new evidence of ongoing magnificence, new proof that the families who occupied these buildings were still at the altitude they claimed. The cost of that proof was continuous and substantial, and it bore no relationship to any rational calculation of return on investment. Cornelius, who had calculated returns on investment with a precision that no contemporary could match, had spent his entire life in the specific understanding that money deployed without a return was money lost. His grandchildren deployed it without returns on a systematic basis, because the social world they inhabited had no mechanism for rewarding restraint. The last Newport cottage ball of the season of 1897, the height of the Gilded Age Newport summer, cost its host $250,000 for a single evening. The host was not a Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilts were among the guests. The point is that this was the competitive environment in which the Vanderbilt fortune was being spent, an environment in which a single evening's entertainment cost $250,000 and in which failure to participate at that level was itself a social statement of the wrong kind. The Commodore had earned his $100 by ferrying passengers across New York Harbor for 18 cents a person. The math of that original accumulation and the math of the Newport cottage season are not reconcilable in any framework that treats money as a finite resource that must be maintained against ongoing demands on its principal. His grandchildren did not need to reconcile them because the fortune was large enough that the discrepancy was not immediately apparent. The Newport seasons continued. The cottages were built and staffed and closed and opened again. The balls were thrown and attended and exceeded and surpassed. And the fortune declined steadily through the specific mechanism of expenditure that exceeded income from the underlying assets. By the time the underlying assets, the railroad, were themselves in decline, the fortune that might have survived a single challenge could not survive both simultaneously. The 1973 reunion at Vanderbilt University is the fact that this story returns to because it is the fact that best measures the distance between what the Commodore built and what his descendants inherited. 120 people, not one millionaire. The Vanderbilt family had not been destroyed by catastrophe. There was no single event, no crash, no lawsuit, no act of government that had taken the money. There had been no Titanic, no assassination, no war that had wiped out the dynasty in a single blow. It had gone in the ordinary way that fortunes go when the people who have them do not understand what they are. It had been divided and subdivided. It had been spent on mansions that required staffs of 40 and maintenance budgets that consumed income faster than the underlying investments generated it. It had been deployed in the service of social ambitions. The ball that cost $250,000, the Newport cottage that cost $3 million, the English Duke who cost $2.5 million plus $100,000 a year, that produced social currency of rapidly depreciating value rather than the financial returns that Cornelius had always demanded from his investments. It had been lost in proxy fights and dissipated in railroad companies that eventually went bankrupt. It had been divided between children who divided it between their children who divided it between their children until the portions were too small to maintain themselves against the ordinary friction of life. Taxes and expenses and the specific overhead of being a Vanderbilt in a world that expected Vanderbilts to look a certain way. The founder had built it from a borrowed $100 and a boat. He had built it by understanding, in the bones, what money was and what it required. He had not taught this to his children because he had not known how, or had not tried, or had not believed it could be taught, or had simply been too busy building the fortune to attend to the transmission of the knowledge that had produced it. The second generation had understood enough to double it. The third had understood enough to spend it beautifully, and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren had not understood it at all. By 1973, the understanding and the money had both run out at approximately the same time. The university still stood. The Vanderbilt mansions that survive are now museums. The Breakers in Newport is managed by the Preservation Society of Newport County and receives approximately 400,000 visitors a year. The admission fee generates the income that maintains the property, which means the castle that Cornelius Vanderbilt II built to express the social position of the family is now paying for its own preservation by charging the public to look at what money used to be able to build. Marble House in Newport. Alva's project, the house that William Cassam paid for and that Alva received in the divorce and converted to a suffragette meeting hall, is also managed by the Preservation Society. It is also open to the public. The ballroom where Alva hosted the greatest social coup of the Gilded Age, the ball that established the Vanderbilts at the apex of New York society, is now available for private events at published rates. The Biltmore in Asheville is still privately owned by the Vanderbilt Cecil family, the descendants of George Washington Vanderbilt's daughter Cornelia, who inherited the estate and who opened it to the public as the only financially viable strategy for maintaining a 178,926 square foot house in the mountains of North Carolina. It charges admission. It sells wine from the estate vineyard. It hosts weddings at published rates. It is one of the most visited private historic estates in the United States. Hyde Park, Frederick William Vanderbilt's estate on the Hudson, is a National Historic Site. The National Park Service maintains it with federal funding because Frederick died without children and left the property to the government, which was the only heir available to a man who had received $10 million from his father and had spent a significant portion of it building a house that no one who came after him had any reason to maintain. The Vanderbilt Mausoleum on Staten Island is still standing in the Moravian Cemetery at New Dorp. The Commodore is there, and William Henry, and several of the children and grandchildren. The mausoleum is built to outlast everything else, which it is doing. Anderson Cooper, the television journalist, is the great-great-great-grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. His mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, who was the daughter of Reginald Vanderbilt, who was the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. He has spoken publicly about the Vanderbilt fortune and what it meant to him and to his mother and to the branch of the family that had descended from the great spending to a specific kind of genteel near poverty. He wrote, with his mother, a book about the family. He has said in interviews that he believes the money was fundamentally corrupting, that the specific relationship that the Vanderbilt fortune created between the people who had it and the world around them was a relationship that made it almost impossible to develop the capacities that would allow a person to sustain either themselves or the fortune. He said something else. He said that he was a big believer in the corrosive effects, the cancerous effects of that kind of money. He said this as a man who grew up knowing that the fortune his great-great-great-grandfather had built was gone, and who had watched his mother live the specific life of a person who had the Vanderbilt name without the Vanderbilt resources, who had had to build her own career and her own income as a designer and artist, who had in fact done this successfully, but who had done it in the specific context of a family that had expected for 100 years that the money would always be there and who had been wrong. Gloria Vanderbilt died in June of 2019. She was 95 years old. She had built a genuine career and had accumulated a genuine estate through her own work. Cooper has said that she did not leave him money, that she told him she was not leaving him anything, that she believed in him being his own person and finding his own way. He found his own way. He is, by any measure, a success. He is also the great-great-great-grandson of the Commodore, who left 120 descendants without a millionaire among them in 1973, who built the largest fortune in American history from a borrowed $100 and a boat, and who died without transmitting the understanding that had made it. The Vanderbilt name had value. The fortune had not been there for 3 generations. She had rebuilt something from nothing. Not his nothing, but her own. The Commodore died on January 4, 1877, at his home on Washington Place in New York City. He was 82 years old. He had been ill for months with what his doctors described as a bladder infection, and what the social conventions of the era preferred not to discuss in more specific terms. He died in the company of his second wife, Frank Crawford, whom he had married in 1869 at the age of 75, and who was by all accounts genuinely devoted to him in a way that his first wife Sophia had been devoted without the benefit of his genuine attention. He left $94 million to his son, smaller amounts to his other surviving children, and $1 million to the university in Nashville. His last days were spent in the company of spiritualists to whom he had become attached in his old age, in the specific way that people who have spent their lives focused entirely on the material world sometimes turn in its final months to the possibility of something else. He sang hymns. The people who were present in his final days reported that he sang Methodist hymns in a voice that retained some of the strength of the man he had been, even as the body was failing. The voice that had negotiated with Andrew Carnegie and Jay Gould and the railroad men of the American economy was singing hymns in a bedroom on Washington Place. The man who had told a reporter that the public be damned was singing about the Lord. He was not, by any honest accounting, a good man. He was a great one, in the specific sense that the word great applies to people who accomplish things of extraordinary magnitude rather than moral excellence. He was ruthless with his competitors, cold to his family, contemptuous of people he considered weak, and indifferent to the suffering that his business practices sometimes produced. He gave $1 million to found a university, and considered this sufficient philanthropy for a lifetime of accumulation that would have made him the equivalent of a $200 billion fortune in today's terms. He built something that lasted 48 years past his death before the last of it was dispersed among descendants who could not produce a millionaire between them. What he failed to build lasted longer. The Commodore borrowed $100 from his mother and built the largest fortune in American history. His descendants gathered at the university he had founded and could not, between them, produce a millionaire. That is the Vanderbilt story. That is what 9 heirs do to the greatest fortune in American history, when nobody explains what the fortune actually is. The mausoleum is still there. The money is not.